Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us on this afternoon, where we've got two incredible academics, practitioners, doctors, bringing really interesting perspective to bear for this conversation tonight. We've got a lot of you online joining us, and we appreciate you logging in and spending a little bit of time with us. There is going to be an opportunity to ask some questions, so please put them in the chat box below. I'm John McGarvey. I am one of the co-founders and CEO of Dow Labs, a traditional Chinese medicine and lifestyle company based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Our conversation this afternoon is very relevant and very timely. It's about treating post-COVID symptoms in situations, which obviously is something that is impacting many people around the world, particularly as it relates to issues of sleep, mental fatigue, fog, et cetera, and a little bit of immunity as well, because that's something as the masks come off and the PRL stands are a bit less full than they once were, it's still something that we need to take extremely seriously. So I'm joined this afternoon by two extremely accomplished doctors who are going to introduce themselves. Dr. Michael Turner, who is joining us from the state of Washington, who will bring sort of a Western integrative holistic approach to the conversation. And a colleague of mine, Dr. Eric Karchmer, who's joining us this morning, his time from Taiwan, who's going to bring more of an Eastern ancient approach. So with that in mind, I'm going to let both of these individuals introduce themselves and we'll get on to the discussion. Dr. Turner?
Sure. Thank you, John. Glad to be here. My name is Michael Turner. I'm an MD. I grew up in California and I went to Stanford as an undergrad, studied human biology. Then I took some time off from med school actually and was a school teacher. So I was a classroom school teacher for several years, which I greatly enjoyed and which I bring into my practice every day as well. I went to medical school then at Harvard and then did my residency in physical medicine and rehabilitation at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. I've been practicing in Washington State. It's been a great place to raise my family and a great place to build today what is my integrative and holistic practice to help patients solve their problems, but also to promote wellness and health for the best of their ability.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Karchmer, if you want to give us a little bit of your background and tell us kind of your approach to health and wellness.
Absolutely. Thanks, John, for moderating this discussion. So I'm a doctor of Chinese medicine and also an anthropologist. I got my start in Chinese medicine years ago when I had just graduated from college. I was an undergrad at Princeton University and went through Princeton in Asia to teach in China, and I taught for several years in China and then in Taiwan. And that led to ultimately to graduate school, both in anthropology, but then also I ended up spending 5 years back in Beijing studying Chinese medicine at the Beijing University of Chinese Medicine. And since then, I've kind of been wearing two hats. I've been running my own Chinese medicine clinic, mostly in North Carolina, eventually also teaching anthropology, primarily also in North Carolina. In the past year, I've been back in Taiwan through a Fulbright Scholar Fellowship, working on a new research project here. Anyways, it's been a fun journey, kind of moving between those two different academic worlds. One, the clinical world of Chinese medicine, and the other, the academic world of anthropology.
So what makes this conversation a lot of fun is both these individuals are bringing very unique but very important and profound experiences to the discussion. And so let's start with you, Dr. Turner. Obviously, we see the numbers from a COVID standpoint. The headlines are going in the right direction, but we hear more and more about people suffering from long-term symptoms associated with, long-term COVID or even short-term COVID, for that matter. And it's still, prevalent in our society. I'll take, for example, former President Obama was diagnosed with COVID yesterday. So it's still very much around, but we understand that you treat a lot of people who are suffering from symptoms that date back months and months. Can you talk about your approach? What do you find that is working for you and your patients? And then as well, any other perspectives that you've got through the lens of long-term COVID?
Sure, John. Well, the first thing we want to do is if they're having any respiratory symptoms, we want to ask the question, is there still an active COVID pneumonia going on, right? So that can be assessed partly on their clinical status, respiratory rate, O2 sats, subjective symptoms of shortness of breath, for example. And we can also get a lung CT scan if we need to. If we see ongoing respiratory problems and still some signs of a pneumonia, then we need to deal with that. Most effective typically is a course of strong anti-inflammatories like a prednisone or similar such equivalent. So that's question number one. Question number two in my mind is, how is their adrenal function? We know that the COVID virus can affect the adrenal glands. We know they can cause inflammatory damage and therefore low function of the adrenal glands. And so many times they have symptoms of low adrenal function, such as fatigue, the brain fog, particularly morning fatigue. If you have a great night's sleep and you still wake up feeling like you're dragging, that's a cardinal sign of low adrenal function. So we can screen for their adrenal function through some common blood labs, nothing too fancy about it, but those can be highly insightful. Step three is we want to reduce inflammation in the brain. So many of the symptoms from long COVID are driven by inflammatory or oxidative stress of the brain. This would include obviously brain fog, but things like loss of sense or taste of smell, which basically just have to do with nerves that go from your eyes or your nose or your mouth, right, to the certain centers in your brain. Those are called cranial nerves, and they can undergo what we would call neuroinflammatory damage, and we want to reverse that. So we want to reduce and reverse inflammation in the brain. This can be done with certain supplements, like fish oil is one of my favorites. NAC is another one. Acetyl L-carnitine is another one. Resveratrol is another one. Or through certain medications, ivermectin, for example, or the prednisone or methylprednisolone equivalents can reduce inflammation in the brain. So that's a major target. Finally, we want to improve circulation. So we also know that one of the problems is lack of adequate circulation in the body. We know that COVID, for example, predisposes towards blood clots. We know that the spike protein damages the lining of the blood vessels, what we call the endothelium. So we have endothelial damage, and we have blood that has predisposition to clotting, or in fact does form what we would call microclots. So we want to reverse that process. We want to do everything possible to improve a person's vascular status and circulatory status. So this can be done through supplements, through exercise, again, through certain medications to try to improve someone's vascular health. So those are my four initial approaches.
And thank you for that. I think we'll turn it to Dr. Karchmer in Taiwan. Talk about your experience, both in Taiwan on the scholarship that you're studying under right now, which includes a tremendous amount of COVID research, and then as well, just from the Chinese medicine perspective, Dr. Turner is talking about, adrenal functions, blood clotting, things of that nature. What can Chinese medicine offer as a solution?
Taiwan's been a very interesting place to be in the past year. There's been Taiwan is one of the countries in the world where COVID's been controlled actually quite well overall. At the moment, there's only a handful of cases every day, so which is quite impressive. So they have a very strong public health system here. But there's also been a lot of participation of doctors of Chinese medicine, both in the treatment of patients with COVID and also helping patients recover. The perspective from Chinese medicine is really interesting. The world of Chinese medicine, its origins go back several thousand years, kind of before there was ever a concept of microorganisms and virus and things like that. So Chinese medicine works through symptoms, if you will. It starts with a presentation that the patients have, and you kind of then work backwards towards a treatment. So a couple things to keep in mind. First, in Chinese medicine, something like COVID, but any kind of externally contracted condition is thought to be brought by things like wind and cold and dampness. So Chinese medicine is one trying to think of like how to drive those drive those pathogens out. And then when people are sick, and if you're, for example, like me, I'm mostly working with people who are recovering, have long COVID. You're also trying to think of what are the impacts of COVID on the body. And in Chinese medicine, I think one really interesting perspective is Chinese medicine is very good at thinking about what's called deficiencies. You might think of that as sort of a way of talking about your immune system, or your way of your body being sort of run down, if you will, vulnerabilities in kind of very broad strokes, but it's quite effective at thinking about that. So with something like a COVID infection, you want to think about how has the body been, how has it been sort of injured, damaged, hurt, or various ways. So you might think about that in terms of, say, something like qi, you may produce a qi deficiency. So then you need supplements that are going to get at the qi deficiency. Many people are familiar with something like ginseng. That's something that would be very effective at getting at that. But then you need to combine it with things that are either going to help deal with sort of the lingering kinds of symptoms. Another important idea in Chinese medicine that, again, a little bit hard for folks to wrap their mind around, but this idea of dampness or phlegm, this idea of fluids not moving in the body. And so I've seen this with a lot of my own patients where they're just stuck with kind of sort of phlegm or in their throat, chest area. And so Chinese medicine there's a lot of effective herbs for helping to kind of break that up. So together with things like that will support something like a qi deficiency, you can help kind of like work with the body to help restore it and then kind of drive out whatever the remaining pathogens are. It could be wind, dampness. So a very different kind of approach, but also very, very intriguing. And there's been a lot of involvement with Chinese medicine doctors here in Taiwan to help folks here to get better and stay healthy during the pandemic.
I think we're talking about things like adrenal and morning fatigue and qi deficiency. So a lot of terms are being thrown around here. Dr. Turner, I'm just going to kind of throw this out there. What kind of success are you experiencing with your patients and the 4 steps you kind of walked through a couple minutes ago?
A good amount of success, John, thankfully. I would say the positive note is if you have long COVID, by no means is it an interminable sentence that can't be understood well and cannot be remedied. There are ways to understand this disease now in terms of what I mentioned before, those types of underlying pathological mechanisms, and there are certain interventions that are known to be helpful. I take my cue in large part from an organization called the FLCCC, so I highly recommend that to all of your listeners. FLCCC stands for Frontline COVID Critical Care Consortium. And you can find them online. They publish protocols for treating COVID, and they have a research-based protocol for treating long COVID. It's quite effective, has a very good scientific rationale. I kind of say they're like the Wikipedia of treating COVID, essentially. And they came together as a group of doctors and physicians, actually started in New York State, ICU physicians who came together and said, let's share best practices. COVID's sweeping through New York. This is horrible. And how do we come together and do something rational and effective for our patients? So they moved on from there, and they now publish quite effective long haul protocols. So the short answer is just to give you an example, I had a student who was a PhD in math at UC Berkeley and had to stop out of his program because his brain fog from long COVID was so intolerable. He called me, he was home on vacation, out of state at his parents' house on sabbatical, and said, if I can't solve this, I can't continue my career. Okay. We got him going. A few weeks into it, he's feeling better. I got him on some NAC, some vitamin D, the fish oil, a dose of ivermectin, a dose of methylprednisolone, some of these other things. Okay. Long story short, we worked our way through this FLCCC protocol successfully to the point he's back in school, he's back in California, he's back teaching, he's finishing up his PhD program, right? So I've seen many stories like that. People can definitely get better and in many cases actually resolve the long COVID syndrome. So I'm quite optimistic about it, frankly.
That's wonderful. Eric, what about you from the sort of Eastern experience that you're seeing at hospitals and clinics in Taiwan?
I think people really need to not despair. Chinese medicine is an amazing approach in this situation. I think as well, as well. So I've seen patients do very well. Things like brain fog, fatigue. Those are that's like the sweet spot in Chinese medicine. Those are things that Chinese medicine doctors are very familiar with working with. So I've had, I'm going to try and think of a good example, a case of mine. I remember a patient who, and this, I don't know if this idea of deficiency can help people think through this, but a patient who was a recent a new mother, had given birth about 6 months before she contracted COVID. From the perspective of Chinese medicine, the whole, giving birth, labor and delivery, nursing, all those are very depleting kinds of things. I think any mother can kind of relate to that. Then you'd put a COVID infection on top of that, and she just couldn't get better. She was sometimes low-grade fevers in the afternoon, and just struggling. And kind of a combination of Chinese herbs really helped to bring around in just a couple of weeks. So it's not ironically, it's not terribly hard to treat from the perspective of Chinese medicine, but I think people have to kind of be aware that that option is out there, and get in touch with a good local practitioner. You've really got some good options.
I think that's wonderful. And a question that we were just emailed is, let's talk about the treatment of, the brain fatigue, the brain fog, and sleep and insomnia. I know there's a bit of a connection to just immunity in general. Sleep is kind of Mother Nature's healer, reset button. And so I think what would be interesting is if we could get both of your perspectives on just those types of symptoms and how your respective fields kind of bring solutions to bear. So Dr. Karchmer, do you want to kind of talk about that from the lens of Chinese medicine?
Yes, absolutely. So we might think of immunity issues more broadly through this lens of deficiencies. And that's really the key in Chinese medicine to treating many types of really chronic insomnia. So if you could think of, maybe the term ungrounded might be helpful for listeners here, but if you can think of sort of your body as being sort of ungrounded, often folks will find when they're trying to sort of wind down and get ready for bed, that their mind seems to be sort of waking up and it's racing at night. They're perhaps even feeling hot and agitated. Those sorts of symptoms in Chinese medicine are often kind of, especially when it's something that's been going on for a long period of time, or it's been gradually sort of developing over years. That idea of deficiency is a really important way of thinking through that. And so there's a number of different approaches. And so sometimes you have to fine tune exactly how to approach it. But there's a number of different approaches in Chinese medicine to kind of really get at those underlying symptoms. You're often going to have fatigue and brain fog and other issues kind of during the day. And so the approach in Chinese medicine in that situation is sort of to build the body back up, which then somewhat counterintuitively, but this is really how it works, allows you then to kind of relax at night and actually calm down and sleep. So there's this idea in Chinese medicine that the yang energy of the day has to kind of move into the yin interior of the body in the evening, and that's what doesn't happen when you've got these various kinds of deficiencies. You might call them sort of immune-related issues, but more broadly, it's bigger than that in Chinese medicine. It's really deficiencies, and so that yang energy can't go inward for you to allow you to recover at night, and it kind of flies away, and that's when you've got this racing mind and sort of insomnia that just will plague people for years and years. So it's a really interesting idea, and once you kind of get on the right sort of treatment, you can have some really profound effects, and people can really start sleeping much better, and feeling so much better during the day.
So we're talking about herbs and by extension, acupuncture needles and whatnot. Mm-hmm. Dr. Turner, from your vantage point, what are kind of the top three things sort of this community should know about sleep, long-term COVID, and the connection to brain fog and whatnot?
Question to me, John?
Yes, it was. Mm-hmm.
Oh, sure. Well, so, really interesting what Dr. Eric was just mentioning there about the energy transfer at night. That got me thinking, one of my top tips actually has to do with a restful bedtime ritual. That's what I call it, right? So I talk to people and they say, oh, doc, my sleep's terrible. I have trouble falling asleep. Well, what happens? Oh, well, my mind's racing this and that. And I go, first thing we need to do is we need to get a resting bedtime ritual in place. I mean, if you've had children or you've ever taken care of kids, you can't just put them right to bed, right? They can't go from running around the living room, eating sugar, playing with their friends and stuff, and just tell them, okay, Johnny, you're supposed to fall asleep now, right? And I say the same thing goes actually as adults. We just don't have anyone to tuck us in, read us a story, pat our stomach, and give us some warm milk, but we have to learn how to give ourselves a resting bedtime ritual, right? So what does that look like? It means, you're not watching TV, for example, right before bed. You're not paying bills. You're not having emotionally charged discussions with your spouse or your children, right? You got low light conditions. You're doing something restful. You're journaling, you're reading with a little night light, you're listening to calm music, you're soaking your feet in Epsom salts. right? You're stroking your cat. I mean, this kind of thing. You need to put in place a resting bedtime ritual to help yourself transition from the day in which you are trying to solve problems and putting out energy to the night in which you are internally using your energy to recharge, right? And Dr. Eric describes it in a fantastic way. We look at it from a little different way, but it's the same idea, I think, in the end. Internally recharging in the world of Western medicine has to do with hormones that are cycling, right? So there's day and night fluctuations of certain hormones. And this becomes very important, not only for brain function, but for things like the immune system and even things like weight gain. We know, for example, shift work people tend to gain weight. The longer you're on a shift work schedule and your sleep's disturbed, you can just watch people start to gain X number of pounds every month. And it just goes on indefinitely because they've disturbed the hormonal balance that's gone on there. So when I talk about practical applications for sleep, I talk about restful bedtime ritual. Number two, I talk about the conditions of sleep. It needs to be like a tomb, okay? A tomb. A tomb is cold, it's dark, and it's quiet. That's what you need to get deep sleep. And optimal sleep's about 66 degrees. It needs to be dark. It needs to be quiet. I encourage eye shades, blackout curtains, that kind of thing. And then finally, I tell people that they should research and understand the concept of slow wave sleep, right? Not everybody has heard that phrase, but everybody should. There are different stages of sleep, as you may know, and the deepest, most restorative stage is called slow wave sleep. So everyone needs to take time, if they're interested in health promotion, to understand, even better to document, and even better to improve their slow wave sleep. This is where growth hormone gets released, for example. This is where toxins are most efficiently flushed out of the brain. So, for example, a lack of slow wave sleep or a lack of deep sleep is positively correlated with Alzheimer's disease. This is well known for a number of years now. They've tracked people, let's say, at age 50, 60, and they look at their sleep, and the people with the most disturbed sleep have the highest rates of developing Alzheimer's than over the next 10, 15 years. This has been well studied. So those are some of my top suggestions. And there are ways specifically to increase slow wave sleep, whether through exercise, supplements, certain medications, but that's the broad idea.
I think it's wonderfully refreshing to hear both of you bring the experiences that kind of brought you here today and with what you do on a daily basis. And one thing that I'm picking up is it's really a holistic approach, right? Dr. Turner, as an MD, you're talking about fish oil and, Epsom salt and whatnot, and some lifestyle changes. And Eric, I know through our conversations, so much of your research is based on empirical data and evidence that supports kind of things like yang and qi. And I think what makes this conversation and just broadly the themes really exciting is, as we say at Dow Labs, it's a little bit of everything, right? We do not envision a world where everybody kind of rids themselves of a Western MD in their life, just the opposite. But we always talk about, trying to bolster kind of your wellness and health routine with alternative modalities like Chinese medicine or like integrative health and whatnot. And so I think it bears pointing out that this is just really exciting stuff because it takes a little bit of everything. And right now, I think we need a lot of different things to kind of, get us sleeping better and hopefully keeping us healthy, which brings the last sort of question up. If we could talk about immunity for a second. We know there's a connection between sleep and immunity. But as I said earlier, masks are going away. We're not seeing as many Purell stations around. Restaurants are full and whatnot. Dr. Turner, just kind of some thoughts from you and from your experience and your recommendations as an MD. You want to talk a little bit about immunity and kind of what should we be thinking about right now?
Sure, happy to. The first concept I want to understand is that when you sleep, there's a massive cellular turnover and renewal that is happening, right? Let's just ask the question on a typical daily basis, how many new cells get created in your body? The answer is larger than most people would think. The number is 300 billion with a B, okay? So on a typical day, there's 300 billion new cells getting created in your body. Now, you can imagine that part of those cells are cells of the immune system, vitally important. Okay. Therefore, if you are lacking sleep, you are not getting the cellular turnover of your immune system to keep it on levels where it needs to be. One of the most notable studies that I reference on my webpage and in my blog, for example, they took perfectly healthy, perfectly well-rested people, okay, no sleep debt, no sicknesses, no symptoms. Just for one night, they restricted them to 4 hours of sleep, okay? They got them up, drew their blood, isolated one of their most important white blood cells, which is called the natural killer cell, which has a role not only in infections, but against cancer. It's a potent anti-cancer cell as well. They isolated the natural killer cell, put it in a petri dish, and then bombarded it with different kinds of viruses and bacteria to see how active it would be. And the punchline is, after just one night of 4 hours of sleep, natural killer cell activity had declined by 30%. Okay, to me that's striking, right? Their most important immune cell arguably was down 30% in its function after just one night of restricted sleep. What would that mean for a week or 2 weeks or a month or a lifestyle of poor sleep? And the answer is your immune system is just running into the ground. The metaphor I would use with my patients is it's like RPMs. You know, you want your immune system up in the high RPM zone and you're just running on first or second gear. And this becomes even more important when you get sick. So again, let's just use the question of an infection. Could be COVID or whatever. What's happening when you have a viral infection? Well, the virus hijacks the machinery of the cell, takes it over, tells it to stop doing whatever it was doing, and tells it to make more virus. Okay, pretty nasty. Then it blows up the cell and releases billions of viral particles into circulation to do the same exact thing, infect nearby cells, to take them over, to produce more virus, to release into circulation. So you can imagine the doubling time of viral load once this thing gets underway. Okay, so the question is, what's your immune system trying to do? If the virus has its doubling rate, your immune system has to have its own doubling rate. And if it can't keep up, you have a spreading virus. And so in very stark terms, it's a numbers game, right? And either the virus overwhelms the body or the immune system overwhelms the virus. But in the end, only one person's standing and one person's going out. And so when you are asleep, your bone marrow is literally furiously pumping out new antibodies, new white blood cells, putting them into circulation, trying to keep up with that viral doubling rate. And you think when you're fighting an infection, you think, oh, I'm fighting this infection all day long, but it's not quite like that. It's heavily weighted towards sleep, right? Just to put a number and a concept out there, we'll use the 80-20 rule. Let's just say 80% of you fighting the virus happens during your sleep time in a concentrated format. It's very, very much weighted. So when you are asleep, I want you to imagine that your bone marrow is furiously working hard to pump out new cells to keep up with the virus and its doubling rate, and it's trying to take over your body essentially. And that kind of puts a new point of emphasis on it for most people.
And go back to Dr. Karchmer with the last few minutes. What are your perspectives on sleep, immunity, the connection there, or just immunity in general from a Chinese medicine perspective?
So I really want to pick up on something that Michael just said too, about this idea of balance. And I think that can be another sort of all-encompassing idea that's really important in Chinese medicine. And so in fact, one of the things sort of I argue in some of my academic writings is Chinese medicine, when it's trying to heal patients, it's almost thinking in some sense beyond concepts of disease as we know them in conventional or Western medicine, and really thinking about like how to rebalance the body. And that's just absolutely essential. So, and it's really true whether we're talking about long COVID or we're talking about chronic insomnia. The key is kind of getting the body back in balance. And so then figuring out what are the sort of different levers you have to pull in order to do that. If you're not sleeping well, that is going to it may begin with a deficiency, but it's only going to continue to sort of deepen that deficiency. So you've got to find the things that are sort of in the way and kind of address them. And that's going to be true with long COVID. I mean, one of the things that we heard about early on in the pandemic and continues to be true is that folks with pre-existing conditions were the ones that were getting the sickest, ending up in ICU units, often kind of not making it. From a Chinese medicine perspective, a pre-existing condition is just sort of a pre-existing some sort of deficiency or other kind of complication in the body. Maybe not just deficiencies, but those are ongoing complications. Those are so we need. We need to be able to have a way of thinking about a little bit more holistically about our bodies. And I'll kind of give another example to pull it back to sleep. Another very common problem, I already talked about the problem of deficiency, but another really common problem that's very important to address in chronic insomnia. There's a great passage in the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon. It's one of the early classics of Chinese medicine from 2,000 years ago. And it says something to the fact that if the stomach isn't harmonious, the spirit isn't settled. And the meaning of that passage is that if you've got digestive issues, you're not going to sleep well either. So the spirit is sort of a way of thinking about the mind here. So the spirit can't settle, you can't sleep well. So that's sometimes that's something that we maybe don't typically think about. And I often have patients who maybe have years and years of digestive issues. They kind of compartmentalize that and think of that as unrelated to unrelated to their insomnia, or here we might think of extend the conversation to COVID. They might think of those issues as sort of being unrelated to getting sick with COVID and recovering. Is that, well, in Chinese medicine, you really have to think very holistically about that. So, so that may be when I'm dealing with a patient with chronic insomnia, that may be the first thing I have to do is kind of deal with that digestive issues, get that working properly, and then that takes the sort of the block out of the way, and then you can kind of get to the other things that are causing insomnia. And so that's a kind of principle you can extend to other fields as well, potentially long COVID as well. You know, if you've and I've had other patients where they've had long-term digestive issues or other kinds of issues. You've got to kind of focus on those issues. You've got to deal with those issues, and then the person can recover from that chronic cough, the brain fog, the fatigue, the other things they've got going on. So I think this idea of balance and thinking really holistically about the body is extremely important. It's that's a very important emphasis in Chinese medicine. And if we can start to kind of like think that way and try to put the whole picture together, we can then, I think, really make a big difference in our personal lives and in the health of yourself and loved ones around you.
Hear, hear. With that, we're out of time. Dr. Turner, any final thoughts? And how can we learn more about you, and where can people read more about some of the things you've talked about?
Sure. Thank you, John. Glad to help. My website would be the best way. So it's michaelturnermd.com. It's all one word, all lowercase. And I develop personalized integrative solutions to help people live in their best state of health. And I draw on my experiences as a physician, obviously, but also as a teacher and just someone who's personally a high-level athlete and very interested in health and wellness and fitness myself. So I enjoy what I do, and I appreciate the chance to talk with you all today to share this with your community. And if I can be of assistance in some way, I'm glad to do it. I work with patients all over the country, literally Hawaii to Florida to Maine to Minnesota to Texas and all parts in between. So I do a lot of telemedicine through Zoom or phone calls, and so that's no barrier. If people want to work with me, I'd be glad to help.
Awesome. And Eric, how can we learn more about you and some of your research and some of the solutions that Chinese medicine offers?
Well, likewise, I definitely encourage people to go to our website, mydaolabs.com, mydaolabs.com. And I try to do a lot of kind of public outreach on the website. So we've got a good blog there as well. But one of my goals through the company is to try and make Chinese medicine a little bit more relatable, a little bit more understandable to average folks, because I think it's such a valuable modality. So I'd encourage folks to kind of start there, and hopefully that'll be the beginning of a kind of an interesting journey through the world of alternative medicine.
Well, we'll put all that information up on the screen. We thank everybody for participating this afternoon. We'll get this up and circulated, and we look forward to some additional conversations with the two of you on other topics. Let us know if there's a topic that's of interest to you. There's a lot of things we could obviously be talking about, and we'd love to bridge that connection between the East and the West, because as I said earlier, it really does take a little bit of everything. So thanks so much for participating this afternoon, and keep healthy.